Hi, how are you? I'm Mr. Muso. Thank you so much. We are together today. Today we want to look on yet another interesting topic. Today we want to talk about the Maji Maji Uprisings. The Maji Maji Uprisings that took place in Tanganyika. Tanganyika, currently known as Tanzania, in 1905 to 1907. The people in Tanganyika, they rebelled. The people in Tanganyika, they revolted against the German East India Company. Why did they rebel in 1905? Why did they revolt in 1905? That is what we want to talk about today. The Maji Maji Uprising. Before we look into detail about the Maji Maji Uprisings, we'll start by defining the terms. We'll start by defining what is meant by the term Maji. What is meant by the term Maji? Maji, we are talking about water. Today I brought water. The water in Tanzania, it was known as Maji. So Maji, it was water. So we see that the people in Tanzania, they do use water. They were influenced by a medium spirit who was known as Kinjikitile Ngwale. Kinjikitile Ngwale, yet to convince the people that if he sprinkled them using Maji, if he sprinkled them with Maji mixed with millet, it meant that the whites were not going to kill them. The bullets of the whites were not going to be to harm them, since they were protected by the Maji. So today our topic is called Maji Mvura. We are talking about water uprisings. So these were the Maji, these were the waters that were going to protect these people so that they were going to be successful when they rebelled against the whites in 1905. So let's now look on the causes, what led to these Maji uprisings of 1905. We will start by number one, the issue of forced labor. The Germany forced the Tanganyika people to work for them. The Tanganyika people, they lost their lands, they lost their assets, they lost their possessions. Their possessions were taken by the Germans and they established farms. So when they established farms now, they did not have enough labor force. So because of that now, we see that they to force the local people, the Tanganyika people, they were forced to work at the lands, on the lands that belonged to the German East India Company. So because of that now, it brought frustrations, it brought anger. Why? It is because people were being forced to work at the workplaces of these Germans. They worked for long hours. Their working conditions were horrible. Their working conditions were pathetic. There was brutality, there was cruelty when they worked at the lands, at the plantations that were owned by these Germans. So because of that now, people were frustrated, and as a result of their frustrations now, it explains why in 1905 they to say enough is enough. They rebelled against the Germans in 1905. Why? It was because of forced labor. They were forced to work at the plantations of the Germans. Forced labor also came in the sense that the Africans, the Tanganyika people, they were forced to grow cash crops that were wanted by the Germans. The Germans wanted them to grow cash crops. Crops such as cotton, crops such as sisal, crops such as also coffee. So we see that people, they were told to abandon the cultivation of their crops that they used to cultivate, and the Germans had to say that we want you now to cultivate our cash crops, because they wanted to maximize, they wanted to make profits from the cash crops that they wanted the Africans to grow. So that on its own angered the people. Why? It is because they were no longer growing the crops that they used to grow, the crops that sustained them, the crops that gave them lomo of food. But now they were forced to grow cotton. You can't eat cotton. They were forced to grow sisal. You can't eat sisal. So that on its own, it brought anger, it brought frustrations, and by so doing now, the people had to gather courage in 1905. Enough is enough. Let's do something, gentlemen. Let's do something. Let's unite and seek our own independence. How are we supposed to do that? If we come together, we are going to be successful. So we see them doing that in 1905, and by so doing, leading to the Maji Maji Uprisings, Mvura Uprisings, Amanzi Uprisings, Water Uprisings, the Maji Maji Uprisings of 1905. So we see that forced labor, it was in two parts. People being forced to work at the plantations. Number two, being forced to grow crops that they did not want. So that on its own brought anger, brought frustrations, leading to the rebellions of 1905. Let's move on and talk about the second cause, the issue of taxations. The local people, they were forced to pay taxes. These taxes, they were increased time and again. These taxes were so severe to the people. Why? Because people were suffering, people were experiencing, people were facing so many problems. And here now they are forced to pay taxations, forced to pay taxes. So that on its own, again, it brought anger. Why? It is because they could not afford to pay the stipulated taxes that they were made to pay. So that on its own led to the revolt, the rebellions of 1905. And added to that, the people who collected these taxes, the Akidas, they were so brutal, they were so cruel, they used cruelty, they used force to collect these tributes, these taxes. Whenever they came to collect these taxes, they were not smiling like what I'm doing. They came angry, they were not smiling at anyone. They meant serious business. What they only wanted were taxes. And when they had to reach at your place and you give them excuses, you were beaten, you were harassed. So by so doing, people were angered. How can our local people be used by the Germans to harass us, to collect these taxes whilst we are suffering? So that on its own brought anger, it brought frustrations. Yes, hence it explains why the Maji Maji Uprisings took place in 1905, the issue of taxation. Let's move on and talk about cause number 3. The cause number 3 that led to the Maji Maji Uprisings was as a result of the influence of the medium spirits. We see that we had a medium spirit who was known as Kinjikitile Ngwale. What a name. These are the names that you're supposed to give your children when you grow up. A historian, Kinjikitile Ngwale. My Kinjikitile Ngwale, Baba Kinjikitile Ngwale, clearly showing that you are a historian. Give your children historical names. Kinjikitile Ngwale, a medium spirit. So because of his influence, we see these uprisings taking place in 1905. What did Kinjikitile Ngwale do? Kinjikitile Ngwale, he had to inform the people that the Maji, the water mixed with millet, if I use the water, the Maji, and I mix it with a millet, then I sprinkle that manji, I sprinkle the water, it means that the white man's bullet was not going to harm anyone. Nothing was going to occur to you. Nothing was going to take place to anyone. Everyone was going to be secure, was going to be safe. Why? Because the Maji and the millet was going to protect each and everyone. So because of that assurance, people had to take up their arms, people had to gather courage, people were brave enough now. They had to fight the Germans in 1905. They had to unite, they had to mobilize, and we see them fighting the Germans in 1905. Why? It was because of the influence of this medium spirit, the spirit which possessed Kinjikitile Ngwale, informing, telling people what was supposed to be done so that they could remove the Germans away from their area, away from Tanganyika. So Kinjikitile Ngwale played a significant role in causing the rebellions of 1905, 1906, and 1907. So many people, the Matumbi people, the Ngindo people, we see them rising against the Germans. Why? It is because they've been influenced by Kinjikitile Ngwale, the Ngindo, and the Matumbi people. Let's move on and talk about another cause, which is called Chabruma's personal cause. Chabruma was a chief. As a chief now, we see that he had so many wives, but one of the wives was seduced and he lost this wife to one of the local people, and we see that this angered him. His wife gone. Why gone? It is because of this stubborn man. This stubborn man, he had to admire the wife of the Ngoni chief Chabruma. The Mai Chabruma is good. So because of that now, he had to approach Mai Chabruma. He was so courageous, approaching the wife of a chief. Mai Chabruma Makapenga. Mai Chabruma, I love you. Serious, I love you, Mai Chabruma, Mai Chabruma. So because of that now, Mai Chabruma was seduced by this man. And when Chabruma realized that one of his wives was taken by this local man, he was so much angered. And when this man realized that Chabruma realized that one of his wives he had been taken away by him, this man had to flee and had to seek for refuge from the Germans, and the Germans protected this man. So Chabruma had to approach the Germans. You Germans, surrender that man to me. Give that man back to me, because I want to punish him concerning what he had done. He has taken my Chabruma. He has taken my wife. Please, my wife, come back. We see that the Germans refused to hand over this man who had taken Amai Chabruma. So because of that now, we see Chabruma being angered. He had to influence the people. Come here, my people. You see that one of my wives has been taken away by this man, and this man had to seek for refuge from the Germans. So what should we do? We see people now rising in 1905. So the Chabruma cause led to the rebellions of 1905. The people had to rebel. Why? It is because they were sympathizing with Chabruma, who had lost one of his wives, and they had to rebel against the Germans because the Germans were protecting mischievous people, and they wanted this culprit to be handed over to Chabruma so that Chabruma could punish this mischievous person, but the Germans were not prepared to do so. So we see the people rebelling in 1905. Let's move on and talk about another cause, and this one is called the burning of sacred hearts. The missionaries, the German missionaries, they condemned the sacred hearts that were used by the spirit mediums. They had to say that those sacred hearts carried with them elements of witchcraft. So to do away with witchcraft in Tanganyika, they had to order those sacred hearts to be burnt. That angered the spiritual leaders. Why? It is because their hearts were burnt. Their items that they used to do their work was burnt inside these huts. So that on its own led these spirit mediums to influence the people, to mobilize the people, to tell the people, look at these Germans. They are not respecting us. You see how they've burnt our houses. See how they've burnt our items that we use for predicting the current, the future events. So it means that they are not respecting our culture. They are not respecting our norms and values. So we see people being angered. They had to collaborate with the religious leaders. They had to collaborate with the spiritual leaders. So we see the rebellions of 1905 taking place. Why? It is because the local people sympathized with the spiritual leaders. Why? It is because their hearts had been burned. They had been condemned as what houses of witchcraft. By so doing, now people were angered by these actions by the Germans, by the missionaries. Hence the rebellions, the revolts of 1905 to 1907. Let's move on and talk about another cause, and this one is called the use of Akidas and Jumbes. The Akidas were the Arab Swahili traders, and they were employed by the Germans. They were employed by the German East India Company. So their duty, their role was to collect tribute. It was to collect taxes from the local people. But they were so brutal, they were so cruel whenever they collected these taxes from the local people. So because of that, now local people were angered. Why? It is because they were being brutalized. They were being given troubles, problems from their fellow Africans. So that on its own led the people again to be frustrated, to be angered. Why? It is because they were encountering, they were facing problems from their fellow colleagues who were being used by the Germans to brutalize them. So as a result of that, now the people yet to say enough is enough. In 1905, they to rebel against the Germans. Why? It is because they were frustrated by the use of the Akidas to the use of what the Akidas to use or to collect taxes using brutal or ways which were not proper. So by so doing, the rebellions, the revolts of 1905 were possible. They took place. The Jumbes, these Jumbes were local chiefdoms, but now they were puppet leaders. They were now dancing according to the tune of the Germans. They were now doing what the Germans wanted them to do. They were no longer ruling the local people. They were no longer following what the local people were doing. Instead, they were now being given orders. They were now pleasing the Germans at the expense of the local people. So this led the local people to be frustrated. Why? It is because their leaders, these Jumbes, they were no longer representing them. Instead, they were now representing the interest of the whites. So by so doing, people were frustrated, people were angered, explaining why the rebellions of 1905 took place. Why? It is because people were frustrated by the use of their local chiefdoms by the Germans. Hence, the rebellions of 1905. Let's move on and also talk about another cause. Another cause was the loss of land. The local people, they lost their lands. They lost their lands. Their lands were taken away by the Germans. When they lost their lands, they started to face serious problems of hunger, problems of poverty, problems of starvation. Why? It is because their lands had been taken away by the Germans. So because of that, now they no longer had enough land to tilt or cultivate their crops. So because of that, they were frustrated, and in 1905, 1906, 1907, they rebelled against the Germans so that they could reclaim their land which had been taken away by the Germans. Unfortunately, they were not successful. So one of the grievances that led these people to rebel in 1905 on the Maji Maji Uprisings was the loss of land. Another cause that led these people to rebel in 1905, it was because of the Bomba Massacres. We see that on the Bomba Massacres, the Ngoni chiefs, the Ngoni chiefdoms, the headsmen, they were invited for a meeting by the Germans. The Germans had to invite these Ngoni chiefdoms, the headmen, come for a meeting, come, there's a meeting, come for a meeting, come. And the headsmen and the chiefdoms, they to take heed, they to go for this meeting that they'd been invited by the Germans. They went there with good faith. They thought that these people wanted to discuss with them. So they to attend this meeting. Unfortunately, they did not know that the Germans had something behind their minds. They wanted to massacre, they wanted to murder them. So because of serious disagreements at this meeting now, we see that these local chiefdoms, these local headmen, these local people, they were killed, they were brutally murdered, they were brutally massacred on the Bomba massacres. So that angered the people. Why? It is because their local people had been murdered, massacred in 1896-97 on the Bomba massacres. So because of that now, people could not do anything in 1896-97. They had to wait for an opportunity, and the opportunity to show that they were not pleased about the death of their local leaders came in 1905. So in 1905, they had to rebel against the Germans. Why? They were trying to revenge the death of their leaders who had been massacred on the Bomba massacres. So these are some of the causes that we have on the Maji Maji uprisings. So when the people rebelled, we see them fighting against the Germans, but unfortunately they were not successful. Why were they not successful? It was because some chiefdoms did not join immediately the uprisings. Some had to join later. So by so doing now, we see that the uprisings were largely unsuccessful. Why? Because the Tanganyika people, the local people, were not all that united. And the people lost faith. They lost confidence in their spiritual leaders, Kinjikitile, telling the people to use Maji and millet. People died because you can't face the white man's bullet when you are sprinkled with water or millet. The bullet kills. So many people were killed. So many people were massacred. Why? Because the whites were using superior weapons, unlike the Africans. So because of that now, people lost confidence in their spiritual leaders, and by so doing, these uprisings were largely unsuccessful. These uprisings were also unsuccessful. Why? It is because the whites had so many advantages. They had better communication methods, they had superior weapons, and by so doing now, it led that the Africans automatically were not going to be successful in these uprisings. So the Africans were defeated, they were unsuccessful in these uprisings, and by so doing now, the Germans were able to conquer, they were able to subdue, they were able to suppress the Africans that had rebelled against them in 1905 to 1907. So because of that now, what are we saying? We are saying that although the Africans rebelled against the Germans in 1905, they were, however, unsuccessful. Why were they unsuccessful? It was because of disunity and also the use of inferior weapons. So by so doing, we see them becoming unsuccessful. Let's have practice questions on the Maji Maji uprisings. Number one, practice question number one. To what extent were the Maji Maji uprisings of 1905 as a result of German exploitation? To what extent were the Maji Maji uprisings of 1905 as a result of German exploitation? 25 marks. Number two, the Maji Maji revolts of 1905 to 1907 were caused by economical reasons. Discuss. The Maji Maji revolt of 1905 to 1907 were caused by economical reasons. Discuss. Number 3, a revolt against colonial administration and Germany policies. A revolt against colonial administration and Germany policies. How far true is this verdict in light of the Maji Maji Uprisings of 1905? So you can use these questions to apply what I've been teaching on the Maji Maji Uprisings. Thank you so much for your time. I am Mr. Muso.